Howdy my totally always tubular gamers, we're back with, you guessed it, another video. Thanks for coming back to the channel. If you're new here, maybe stick around for a while. I got a fun video for you. Today we're going to be talking about some modern underrated games. Now a few weeks ago I talked about some modern hidden gems and plenty of people mentioned some really awesome games, and so I thought today I would talk about underrated games. I wouldn't say these games are necessarily hidden gems, and in many cases these games are actually quite successful in terms of reception and sales numbers. It's just nowadays I really don't hear that many people talk about them. Like, not only do I not hear enough people talk about them, I feel like they don't get enough credit either. People always talk about the best this, the best that, and they're not mentioning these games when sometimes these are some of the best games you could play nowadays. And so I've got a fun curated list of 10 games that I believe are underrated and are worth playing. Of course, as always, let me know down below. I'm always looking for new games. Maybe there's a game that you think I should have mentioned, or maybe a game I shouldn't have mentioned. Either way, let me know how you're feeling down below. Please like, share, comment, subscribe. We got the Patreon and the super thanks. Any support is truly, and I mean truly, greatly appreciated. Now, before we begin, I do want to give a shout out to today's sponsor. Hey there, do you like car combat games? Did you ever enjoy the battle mode in Mario Kart? Then you might be interested in today's sponsor, Guns N' Wheels. Guns N' Wheels is an upcoming indie car combat game that I've had the pleasure of trying out the last few weeks, and I gotta say, it's pretty cool. Guns N' Wheels blends Mario Kart battle and stylized tanks. You'll get to compete in exciting arena battles fusing arcade car physics, powerful pickups, destructible environments, and of course, guns. The game is currently in alpha, but already has a ton of promise to it and a decent amount of content. It's slated to come out sometime next year, and by backing the Kickstarter, you'll get access to the full game. It's going to launch with a lengthy single player and have some online-offline multiplayer options. The game really reminded me a lot of the We Play Tanks minigame, and that can only be a good thing. You can find the link to the game's Kickstarter down below. It is a specialized link, and if what you've seen interests you, then I recommend you check it out. It might be the car combat game you've been waiting for. New car combat games are pretty rare, so when one shows up, check it out. It's a totally tubular time, and thanks again to Guns N' Wheels for sponsoring today's video. Now, when I was making this list, one of the first games that came to mind for me was Dying Light 2. Really both Dying Lights, but for today's video I'm talking about Dying Light 2. And I do want to give a shout out to the publisher for hooking me up with a code. I played this game a few years ago, but thanks to them I'm able to try it again nowadays, and it's way better now than it was even a few years ago. And I really do feel that this game and the first game are quite underrated. Like, both games sold incredibly well and they were decently reviewed, but I just feel like they're not talked about all that much, and that's a shame because Dying Light 2 is actually a pretty awesome zombie game. While the game does take place after Dying Light 1, many years actually after Dying Light 1, you absolutely do not need to play the original game to understand the story here. It takes place in this walled city in Europe, and the game stars Aiden, this parkour master to say the least, who's looking for his long-lost sister Mia. Now, if you asked me what the weakest part of both Dying Light games, I would tell you the story. This game's story, yeah, it's not that great. The characters are rather forgettable. Really, this entire story's forgettable. It feels a little generic. The dialogue isn't great. The story's not too good. What is cool is you can make a ton of choices that really will actually affect the narrative and the missions you'll play. Like, the choices actually mean something here, and there are some serious consequences, which is more than I can say about most games with choices where it's really the illusion of choice. Here, it really does mean something. But while the story might be lacking a little bit, the gameplay is absolutely where Dying Light 2 shines. It is an open world zombie killing parkour adventure, and it's even better than the first game when it comes to the gameplay, in my opinion. It's super refined, the controls are fantastic, the parkouring is excellent, the open world is great, it looks great, the traversal really is just such a highlight to this game. Like, it just feels so nice. It's so much fun to just run around and traverse all over the place. It's a great time there. And when it comes to the combat, it was good back when the game launched, but it's even better now. And they even just reintroduced guns back into the game, which are decent enough. They're about as useful as they were in the first game. And then there's a bunch of different RPG mechanics here. You can really customize your weapons, and there's the skill trees, there's factions, and who you side with really can affect the other factions. This isn't like Starfield where you can join everybody. If you join someone in this game, there's a good chance the other faction is just going to get wiped out completely, so that's pretty cool. The open world is massive, it's way bigger than the first game, and I think it's actually decently well designed. I had a lot of fun traversing it, and this is a pretty big game, especially after the updates. Like, if you just do the golden path, you could probably finish it in around 20 to 30 hours, but you can easily double that if you want to do a bunch of the side content. The game even has 4-player co-op. I feel like a lot of people forget that about Dying Light, that it does have full co-op. They also updated the nights. In the original game, when it was nighttime, it really wasn't all that much more threatening. It wasn't as tense as the originals. Here, it's a lot more like that, and it actually is a bit more difficult and serious when you're at night, and the rewards are absolutely worth it. Dying Light 2 really is one of the best zombie games of the last like 5 to 10 years, and I just don't feel like a ton of people talk about it nowadays. Like, it had a ton of hype when it was about to come out, when it came out, and then after that, poof, it feels like it's just not talked about all that much. So here I am to talk about it. One of the best zombie games I've played in recent memory. It's just a really good game, and it's gotten even better thanks to the updates. And so here's another game that has been underrated seemingly forever, and that is Sleeping Dogs. I very much remember when Sleeping Dogs came out back in the 360 era, and people were like, oh, it's a little fun alternate modern crime game. And then when the game was re-released a few years later as the definitive edition, I was like, okay, more eyeballs are on it. This is when it's really going to take off, and a lot of people are going to see how great this game is. And then, yeah, it didn't. Here we are like 10 years later, and I'm still hyping the game up as underrated. The game actually has an incredibly unique take on modern open world crime games. It really doesn't play much like GTA at all. It really does do its own thing. It takes place in Hong Kong and stars this undercover police officer Wei Shen as he infiltrates a triad organization, and that's all I'm gonna say. The story is actually pretty solid here. Our main character is actually quite likable, and I think the story is more than solid enough. This game originally was being developed as part of the True Crime series, but it did eventually become its own thing, but it very much still feels like those True Crime games. The game drops you into a pretty decent sized city where there's plenty of main missions to go through, there's some side missions, and there's plenty of other things to see. Since Shen is an undercover cop, you'll be on both sides of the law here. You'll be a good law-abiding citizen where you actually get to help people out as a cop, you know, help the SWAT team out. But of course there are plenty, and I mean plenty of instances where you will have to, you know, do some criminal activity. You'll partake in activities such as jaywalking, some real shit out here, but there's plenty of instances where you'll be fighting the police even though you're an undercover cop. Something about this game that's unique is the combat is relatively different from most modern crime games. It's much more like the Batman Arkham games where it's hand to hand, there's plenty of countering and special moves to do, and it actually feels pretty decent. But there's plenty of third person shooting as well. You get into tons of gunfights, and the shooting is actually pretty decent here. And when you're not in combat, you're most likely driving, and the driving is actually pretty solid in this game. It is very arcadey, but it still has a nice feel to it. You actually do get a decent sense of speed, and I like driving around this map. I can't really think of many games that take place in Hong Kong, so the map is just unique by default, but it actually is uniquely designed, and it really does feel different. I think the game has a great pace to it. It's got some excellent action. There's plenty of memorable set pieces and missions as well. There's a ton of little DLC missions that are in the definitive edition that are actually worth doing. Some of them are pretty ridiculous where like zombies show up, but these are actually worth doing as well, and it's kind of a wonder how Sleeping Dogs didn't just totally blow up. Like, it's a very solid, capable open world game that doesn't necessarily move the genre forward, but it's still very good at what it does. The presentation is still pretty decent even nowadays. That main menu theme is way too good. The voice acting is really solid. Yeah, there's not much to dislike with Sleeping Dogs. It's not perfect. It sometimes can be a little rough around the edges, and a few of the missions do suck, but the game is still absolutely worth playing. It's a shame here we are like 10 years after the game's release, and I still don't think it gets enough credit. There was going to be a sequel as like a multiplayer spin-off or something. That didn't work out. I doubt we're going to get a sequel at this point, which is a real shame because this game, it's pretty good. And here's a game I've talked about a few times, but I'm always going to hype this game up, and that is Psychonauts 2, my favorite game from 2021. And yeah, it was nominated for a few awards, and it did get decent critical praise, but I feel like not enough people played this one. Really, both Psychonauts could be on here, but that original game isn't exactly modern. That game was underrated for just an eternity, and this game feels like it'll be underrated forever as well. Taking place pretty much right after that VR spin-off, it sees Raz joining the Psychonauts to try and figure out who captured their leader. And how do they do this? They go into the mind of others. Just like the first game, the gimmick really is going into people's minds, sorting out their trauma and baggage, and getting the answers that you seek. The story is actually very good in this game. I really enjoy the characters. There's not a bad character here. All of the dialogue is really solid. The game is funny. It has a good sense of humor, and it's just incredibly entertaining throughout. And while I don't think it's required reading to play the first Psychonauts, I very much think you'll get a lot more out of the story if you play the original, and a lot of these jokes will hit harder. The story is just very good in general. The gameplay is really solid as well. It's a very good, tight 3D platformer that actually plays incredibly similar to the original game. Raz has a decent moveset, and you're placed into a kind of an open area in the real world that you can explore. and find these collectibles. There's even some side missions here, but the main meat and bones of this game is going into people's minds. And I gotta say, the levels in this game are like just as good as the first games. They're incredibly memorable. They're all very unique and just different from one another. They are all incredibly visually different, but they all also play differently. Some of them are just straight platforming challenges. Others, you might actually have to do these challenges. They all have little gimmicks thrown into them, and I really enjoyed a lot of these. The game was just incredibly varied throughout. You're always doing something different, and again, I just loved how different all of these worlds really felt from each other. I think the platforming's really solid, the controls and feel are incredibly tight, and when you're doing other things, it's very entertaining. There's really not a bad level here. The game also has a great presentation to it. It looks really good. The art style actually changes a lot depending on the world you're in, and some of them do look incredibly different from each other. I quite enjoy the visuals. They just pop out and they're incredibly exciting to look at. The sound effects and the sound in general, the music, the voice acting, all of that, it's really solid as well. Psychonauts 2 is one of the best platformers of the last decade. It's got a great atmosphere, story, characters, pace, and length to it. It's crazy that the game is as good as it is. It's pretty rare where a sequel comes out like 15 years later and it's even half as good as the previous game, as that original game, but this game might be even better than the original. At the very least, it is just as good as the original, and it is very much worth your time. And hey, would you look at that? It's my former employer's game, Sunset Overdrive. It was developed by Insomniac Games, and it was released on the Xbox One and PC a number of years ago, and I feel like it just never got the attention it deserved. It just kind of came out, and then that was really it. There wasn't a whole lot of buzz beyond that, and it's a shame. It's one of the more unique open world games from the PS4, Xbox One era. It plays actually kind of like Jet Grind Radio, but of course with guns and a more in-depth combat system, taking place in this big open world that is very much modeled after LA. You get to create your own custom character, and it takes place during the apocalypse, or as this game calls it, the awesome apocalypse, where everything really is awesome. Everything's being destroyed by these creatures, but you're just having a good old time. The game has a very in-your-face, fun attitude about it that is very prevalent throughout the entire game. The story is definitely the weakest aspect of this game. It's just kind of there, but the game's attitude, its aesthetic, its visuals are all really solid. But when it comes to the gameplay, like I said, it's very similar to Jet Set Radio. You're grinding all over the place. The traversal mechanics go pretty crazy, and then you're also shooting up the place as well. You get plenty of unique Insomniac weapons to just absolutely maim these creatures. The traversal is actually one of the best parts of this game. They really want you to be moving at all times. There's just tons of things in this open world to keep you moving, whether it's grind rails, bounce pads. They want you moving constantly, and the open world is actually incredibly well designed with this. Like, the amount of traversal options they give you, especially during these missions, is really great. The traversal really is some of the best traversal of any modern open world game, and it's very obvious after this that they would go and work on Spider-Man, which also has great traversal, but the combat is really solid here as well. The traversal makes the combat feel incredibly unique and different. You get a bunch of unique weapons that really aren't even in other Insomniac games, and all of this just leads to a very unique feel. Like, there really is no other game that plays like this. I'd say the closest is Rollerdrome, and that also really still isn't like this. That's very contained little arenas. Here, it is a full open world adventure, and yeah, there's plenty of linear sections as well during the missions, but there's just not really anything comparable for this game. It's just kind of its own beast. Even 10 years later, it still feels incredibly unique. I love the game's personality. The graphics are pretty good. They're pretty great for the time. The soundtrack is actually really great. There's a lot of awesome licensed music that I still listen to nowadays, and then the game has more than enough reason to keep playing. There's plenty of collectibles and side missions. It's got a good length and pace to it. The open world, again, is just so much fun to traverse in. Like, it was such a fun time. I remember just getting really into this game back then, and I've played it even recently, and yeah, the game absolutely still holds up and it's great. The game has co-op, but I wouldn't say there's a lot of people playing it nowadays, and they even threw in a bunch of RPG aspects. You get to upgrade and customize your weapons and character. That's pretty cool. All these years later, Sunset Overdrive is still incredibly unique and underrated. I feel like most people didn't play it, and it's a shame we're never going to get a sequel to this one. I can personally tell you that. But if what you've seen here interests you at all, it is on Game Pass, and it's very cheap on Steam and Xbox as well. Alright, you knew with an underrated games list I had to have at least one driving game on here, and that game is Trackmania Turbo. Now, the Trackmania series has actually been around for quite a while, and there are plenty of other Trackmania games. There's even a newer one that is a free-to-play live service game that keeps getting updates, but my favorite of the Trackmania games has always been Turbo. I was really excited for when this game came out, and I just played the hell out of this game. I played it for weeks and years to come. Like, I still come back even nowadays just for a quick little session, quick little run through Trackmania because it's such a good time. And it absolutely did not get the recognition it deserved back then, and nowadays barely anybody even talks about it. Even the dedicated Trackmania community doesn't really talk about it all that much, and that's a shame because out of all the Trackmania games, this game easily has the best single player. Sure, it doesn't have the most vehicle types or the most content, but it is the most refined and the most fun in my opinion. Now, for the unfamiliar, Trackmania is a very unconventional racing game where it's all about going through these courses and doing time trials rather than racing other cars and being able to bump into them. You're just racing their ghosts. And Turbo features 4 very different unique vehicle types. There's one where you go super fast and drift all over the place. There's Down and Dirty where you play in like a buggy and you drive through the dirt. There's your traditional Stadium mode that's been there really since the beginning of Trackmania, and then there's Turbo. There's Lagoon, as they call it, where you go through all these flips and anti-gravity areas, and this is awesome. When it comes to the track design, it is some of the best this series has ever had. And while it starts out simple enough, these tracks get incredibly complicated and actually pretty lengthy. They'll have you going through some crazy jumps and obstacle courses, and some of these tracks legit are my favorite of this entire franchise. I really just enjoy this game. I also love the attitude and atmosphere. Like, it's just got this fun vibe to it. Like, it's not taking itself super seriously, but you're just there to have a good time, and the music absolutely reflects that. The music is just fantastic in this game. The game still looks great. It runs incredibly well. When it comes to the controls and the feel and the handling of this game, oh, it is so good. It is some of the best of any driving game. Like, all these years later, this shit still feels really good. When you do a big ass drift, or you go through a tough obstacle course, or you do really any of the lagoon stuff, oh, it is so good. And then the campaign is actually pretty decently length. There's a ton of replayability here to try to get all the best times and see all of the tracks. It's really quite varied since there are 4 different vehicle types, and yeah, other Trackmania games like Nations Forever have like 8 different vehicle types, but not all 8 are great. Here, all 4 of these are great. They're incredibly fun, and this was another one of those games that I just did not want to put down from the moment I started playing it, and I can come back to this game really at any time and just still smile and be like, wow, this game is still so good. All these years later, the cars feel great, the tracks are great, and it really is a shame that this game did not have a longer shelf life. Trackmania kind of lives and dies by the community. Sure, the single player content helps, but the community really keeps these games alive, and this game, yeah, they just didn't take to it. They didn't like the tools to create maps, and a lot of people went back to the older games. And then the new Trackmania came out that is not as good in my opinion, has a great map track editor, and that's where you'll find a majority of the community nowadays. But despite that, I still do recommend Turbo. If you like driving games, oh, you're gonna love this game. It really is a blast. It's incredibly cheap nowadays and shouldn't be slept on. And so here's a game I've actually never talked about on the channel, and that is Rage 2. Now, I very much remember when the original Rage came out. I got it the day it came out, like 12, 13 years ago. Gosh, a long ass time now, and I thought the game was okay, but not like spectacular. And so when Rage 2 came out, I also skipped it. I was just like, I don't really care that much. But I did eventually go back and play it and went, wow, this game's actually pretty good, and I think it is quite a bit better than the original game. And you very much do not need to play the original game to understand this game. In fact, the story, yeah, it's not all that great here. It takes place in an apocalyptic desert where most of humankind was wiped out, and you play as this character named Walker, who really is just trying to survive this shithole. And the story, yeah, it's not that great in this game. The characters are pretty forgettable, and the plotline in general is just kind of there. What makes this game good is the gameplay, where it's a mix of car combat and first-person shooter action set in an open world. I'll just immediately say I think the open world is a lot better in this game than the first Rage. I thought the first Rage had a pretty forgettable, lifeless open world that didn't really have much going on. Here, it feels a bit more alive, there's a lot more to do, and it feels just more varied in general. But when it comes to this game's structure, it very much is that typical open world game. It was co-developed by Avalanche Studios, who also made the Mad Max game and the Just Cause games, and yeah, if you've played those games, you're going to understand this game's structure and format immediately, where there's some main missions to do, plenty of side missions, but a whole lot of outposts to take out. And while the structure and pacing of the game isn't exactly unique or different for this genre, the important thing is that the game is actually fun. The shooting is actually pretty good in this game. Like, the weapons feel really nice, they've all got a good kick to it. You get a bunch of different abilities that make the combat just more interesting in general. The combat actually is more going on here than you would think, and it does feel nice. I'd say the combat really was my favorite part of the game. When you get into these intense firefights and you're just absolutely destroying these people, you're blowing them away with your powers, or chucking the wing sticks all over the place like the original, yeah, the combat is actually really fun. Well, the on-foot combat is really great. There's also the car combat, and this really is just as good as the first games, which was okay. It's all right here. It's serviceable. It's not going to win any awards, and it's not going to be your next favorite car combat game. Like, it's just alright. But at least exploring around the open world and going into all these outposts and just wiping everything out is actually a pretty fun time. Sure, it doesn't reinvent the wheel, and in current year it might actually feel pretty stale to play an open world game like this, but I can still enjoy what this game was trying to do. It does have a unique aesthetic and presentation to it. It really loves the color pink, or at least I'm pretty sure it's pink. My colorblind ass isn't totally sure, but I love how this game looks. The music is actually pretty decent in it as well, and yeah, it was a really overlooked game in general that isn't amazing, and it's not one of the best open world games of the last decade, but it's fun, it's good at what it does, it's really cheap nowadays and on Game Pass, and it very much might be worth your time. And so our next game is probably not a game you were expecting. That is Mario + Rabbids Sparks of Hope, and I know what you're thinking. You're like, wait, Mario on an underrated games list? Yeah, I am actually going to include it. This game came out and I didn't see like anybody talking about it, and then it just totally disappeared. I didn't even see like Nintendo YouTubers really talk all that much about it. Like, it got even less attention than the first game, which I would also kind of argue is a little underrated. Sure, it's Mario, and sure, it's by Ubisoft, but these games are actually unique. They have originality and creativity and actually do try to do something different for both of these series. And I think a lot of people ignored or skipped this one just because of how cold Ubisoft has been the last few years. But don't let that stop you from actually checking this game out, because I think this is actually one of the best turn-based strategy games of the last few years. And I think it's actually a decent improvement on the first game. Sure, it's not going to be the next XCOM, it's not going to be the next legendary turn-based strategy game, but it's actually a pretty solid time. It sees a few Mario characters team up with the Rabbids to take on this new antagonist, and the story's actually half decent here. There's a bunch of original characters, and while the game doesn't take itself too seriously, I still liked it for what it was. When it comes to the gameplay, it is very similar to the first game, where, yeah, it is really similar to the modern XCOM games, where you take cover, you have your pot shots, there's a bunch of abilities, some Mario flair gets thrown in there, like you can jump on enemies. And what's great is all of these characters are incredibly different from each other. Seriously, every single character feels super different, whether they have a unique weapon or a bunch of unique abilities and stats to them. No two characters feel alike. And the game very much wants you to try all of these characters and find your own personal team and favorites, and I really enjoyed that. It actually allowed me to try a bunch of unique combinations, and these characters play so differently from each other that even if you're switching a little bit, the gameplay is going to feel incredibly varied here. Not only is the gameplay during the battles a bit better, but I think it's a lot better in the open world. In the original game, it was just really linear and straightforward. Here there are actual open areas to explore, complete with side missions, collectibles, and secrets, and I think it's actually really great. These are some well-designed areas, and it's actually fun and rewarding to go do the optional stuff. It's not the usual Ubisoft crap where it's just total busy work and it feels like there was no thought put into it. No, there's actually thought put into it. There's puzzles, there's characters, there's actually good rewards for doing these. It's actually worth it. If you just stick to the golden path, you could probably finish the game in around 20-25 hours, but doing everything, you could probably double it, and it really is worth it. This is, again, one of the better turn-based strategy games of the last decade. Yeah, it still is pretty unconventional. It's still a weird crossover, and I know a lot of people don't like the Rabbids, but even if you don't, I still think this game is worth trying. The Rabbids aren't really annoying, and there is some pretty good fan service if you've been a long-time Mario fan. I think the game is worth playing, and it's pretty cheap nowadays. Maybe that was why people didn't check it out at launch, as they knew it was going to go super cheap. There's a bunch of DLC now, even Rayman's in there. And again, despite how cold Ubisoft has been, this is one of their good ones, where it feels like they actually put in a lot of effort and it's not just the typical Ubisoft affair. And that's probably because Nintendo was involved on some level, but yeah, it's a good one. And so here's a fun one and a personal favorite of mine, and that is Bugsnax. Now, Bugsnax got a good amount of attention when it launched with the PS5 all the way back in 2020, but even a few months later, I didn't see like anybody talking about this game, and I absolutely adore this game. I've played through it several times now and just love nearly every aspect with this game. So what exactly is this game if you're not too familiar with it? It's kind of like a first-person monster collecting action adventure game where you do collect these bugs that are also food, and you can feed them to other characters. You really just dropped onto this island looking for somebody, but things change. And yeah, that's actually all I'm gonna say, because I really do enjoy the story of Bugsnax. I love the premise, I love the world, the characters, the writing, the dialogue, and what happens in this game. Yeah, I actually really do enjoy it. I also really love the aesthetic to this game. Like, the presentation is pretty solid, but I just love how it looks. It looks so colorful and unique, and it's incredibly cute. Like, everything's food themed. How could you not like it? There are so many just straight up iconic creatures in this game, like Bunger and Strawby. Like, I have a Bunger in real life. That's how much I like the characters in the world of Bugsnax. But when it comes to the actual gameplay, it's not crazy complex. Really, a lot of it is just catching the bugs and figuring out how to catch them. Usually there's some kind of little puzzle involved with catching every single type, like you have to do something specific. Sometimes it's really obvious and you really can just walk up and catch them. Other times you gotta distract them, you gotta trick them, you gotta trap them. There's actually some nuance to it, and I found it relatively fun, and it's nice to play a monster catching game that isn't an RPG at all. You just catch them and that's it, and figuring out how to catch them really is like the main gameplay hook here. But you'll want to figure out how to catch them all because they're just all so cute, and then you get to feed them to the characters, and then it's kind of horrifying. Anyway, the game has a pretty solid pace and length to it as well. You're constantly going to new areas, you're finding new Bugsnax all the time. You're going to want to catch all of them. Like, the game is just so much fun. There's DLC now, which is free, that introduce big snacks, which are, as the name implies, very big Bugsnax, and these are great as well. The game actually has a pretty awesome soundtrack and is just crazy memorable. Why this game didn't just absolutely take off as the next indie darling that people talk about for years and years, I really don't know. Maybe it was because it was a launch title and it just kind of got lost in the shuffle, but it's a damn shame because this is easily one of my favorite indie games of the last 10, 15 years, really just ever. It's a really solid game. It's incredibly unique and different from every other game on this list, really every other game in general, and how could you not like Bunger, man? And our next game is from a decently well-known franchise. That's the Hitman franchise. Today I'm talking about the modern Hitman trilogy, also known as Hitman World of Assassination. Now, I do want to give a shout out to the publisher for hooking me up with a code. Thank you very much. I get to play through these games again. Now, this is 3 different games all put together. You can only buy all 3 games now. If you bought 1 or 2 in the past, well, you're screwed. You got to buy all 3 now. It's very confusing and annoying. But what I'm here to tell you is that the modern Hitman trilogy is absolutely worth playing. I'm sure plenty of people are like, this really isn't underrated, but I kind of think it is. You know, I hear plenty of people say, oh, there's no good modern stealth games. Stealth games are totally dead. Without Splinter Cell and Metal Gear Solid, this genre is basically dead. And I'm here to go, what about Hitman? For the last like 20 years, Hitman has had good to great, if not fantastic, stealth games. And these newer modern Hitman games like Hitman 2 and 3, these are fantastic. These are some of the best stealth games ever. These are like the best Hitman games of them all. I know plenty of people have asked me to look at the Hitman games. I'm here to tell you I will soon enough. I'm just finishing up World of Assassination and then I'll be able to look at all of them. But these Hitman games, like the modern trilogy, are absolutely worth playing. If you like stealth games, these are just straight up must play games. Like, stealth games in the modern era really don't get better than Hitman 2 and 3. You're dropped into these giant areas and are told to just go take out your target really however you want. There are so many different ways to take out your targets. Like, these games are sandboxes to the fullest. You can mess around for hours in each of these missions and find tons of different ways to take out your target. You don't even have to be stealthy. You can just walk in and gun everyone down. That'll get you good results as well. But being stealthy is very much where this game excels. Like, you can be really stealthy to the point that nobody even recognizes you, nobody notices you even showed up, nobody dies outside of the target. Like, the game really does reward stealth gameplay. And then these missions are like the best missions of the entire series. Not only is there a ton of variety, there's a ton of different ways to take out the targets, but they're just all really unique and a ton of fun. They really do reward creativity here. Like, you can come up with some really kooky creative shit and the game's totally gonna run with it, and usually it works. Goofy shit that like made Blood Money so popular is all over this game. You remember where you like poison the donuts in Blood Money and it's goofy and it actually can get the target killed? Here it's basically the same same thing, but like times 30. There's just a bunch of crazy stuff that can happen to the targets, and no two ways are going to be exactly the same. It's really great stuff. I'm here to just say, do not sleep on the Hitman games. The stealth genre is not dead. It certainly isn't as popular as it used to be, but Hitman is propping it up by itself, at least in the AAA scene. Like, there's plenty of indie ones as well, but when it comes to AAA games, it doesn't get any better than Hitman for stealth. And so to finish things off, we're going to be talking about a game I've talked about several times on the channel, and that is Amnesia the Bunker. It came out last year and got pretty good reception, but I feel like people have already kind of forgotten about it, and it doesn't have the same impact or legacy as like The Dark Descent had, and I think this game is actually great. It was one of the best horror games I played last year, and it's my favorite of the Amnesia games. It's very different from The Dark Descent, taking place in World War I, where you're trapped in this bunker being hunted by this monster, and you're really just trying to make this dynamite to get the hell out of there. Like, it's a great premise, and this game is a fantastic atmosphere and aesthetic to it. It's dark, it's depressing, it's scary. Like, this thing is constantly hunting you, and you actually have a bunch of resources that you're going to need to manage here. You do have a gun, but it's incredibly limited when it comes to ammo, and you'll really have to manage how much light you're going to have in this place. Like, you constantly are using fuel to fill up the generator, and I really thought this was a great system. Like, it really actually brings the pressure. Everything you do has weight. If you're messing around, like, you're really wasting your resources. You can be totally screwed over here, where you will run out of fuel and you won't have any light here, and yeah, it just makes for a really tense atmosphere that really is not like any other game I've played. The closest I could compare this to is Alien Isolation, with the monster hunting you, but this still does feel relatively different from it. The level design is pretty solid. Everything comes together really nice. It doesn't have like a ton of length to it. It takes around 4 or 5 hours, but it certainly is a quality versus quantity situation. Like, this was a really solid horror game that fans of the genre should not miss at all. It's tense, it's scary, it's got a lot going for it, it's incredibly replayable. It scared the absolute crap out of me several times, and I just really enjoyed what this game was doing. And while the game clearly doesn't seem to have the impact that The Dark Descent had, I still think not enough people are talking about it. I think this game is way better than Rebirth and A Machine for Pigs, and yeah, I think it's even better than The Dark Descent. I think the gameplay is better. I think managing your resources is better. Shit, I think the premise is better, and it just really is one of the scariest games of the last few years, in my opinion. And if you like horror games, I really don't think you should miss this one. It was on Game Pass. I'm not so sure now, but it is pretty cheap. But that's it for today's video. Hope you all enjoyed it. Hopefully there was at least one game on here you're not too sure about or you had never heard of that you're going to go check out. Either way, let me know down below. The code word today is bricks, as in what's in walls. And with all that, I'll see you again. Have a good night, day, evening, Christmas, whatever's the closest to you. See ya. Bye-bye.